Awesome. Well, here we are. So thank you all for coming and attending the third webinar in this series. I'm Zoe Thorson. I'm part of the Barista Guild Leadership Council, and we've been working on this project for quite a while now, and it's become an even more important conversation over the last year for us. And we're excited to take some of our findings and also collaborate more with folks such as these wonderful folks that have joined us today on talking about livelihoods and coffee, what that means for businesses, employees, what it means in different places, and for the hourly coffee worker on a global level. So as I said, this is our third of a series. The first one, we just sort of introduced the topic, and the second one last week, Kathy, my peer, did a wonderful interview sort of going over what does a living wage and a living income mean. And in this week, we are going to talk a little bit about what it means for a business, as a business concept. And with that, I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves, starting with Shaheen as our lead speaker here.
Thanks so much, Zoe. My name's Shaheen Hashmat. I am Senior Project Manager at the Living Wage Foundation in the UK. We have been around for around 10 years, but the campaign has been going for much longer than that, and I'll be excited to share some of our journey around that, and also around some of our more recent global work as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaheen. And Jimson?
Hi, Jimson Bienenstock. I own and operate 3 coffee shops in Toronto. I've been in the food and beverage game for a very long time, 15 years in France, in Paris, basically, and then moved to Canada 15 years ago, and been in the food and beverage game for a long time. And here I am.
Thank you. Last but not least.
Hi, I'm Leon Grodski Barrera. I run Cocoa Cinnamon and Little Waves Coffee Roasters with my wife and partner, Areli, and our team of about 35 people. We represent, we're about 70% women and non-binary folks. 60% of us are bilingual, and I think that's it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you joining us. So this also is brought to you by the SCA's Retail Summit, which is basically a newer resource on the SCA page for folks in retail. There is like a wide variety of interesting articles and resources there, and I highly recommend everyone check it out. And then with that, we will move on to the next section here. I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Shaheen. We've already done this introduction.
Wonderful, thanks, Zoe. So where we've been working with employers, as I say, for around 10 years, I'm excited to share with you an overview today of the research and the feedback we've had from our network of living wage employers about the benefits that they've seen across the business as a result of implementing a living wage. And if we could move to the next slide, before I'll get into that, I'll share, as I say, it's the 20th anniversary of the campaign, 10 years of the foundation, and there are some important milestones along the way which really help to explain just how important our relationships with businesses have been, not only in doing their part in paying a living wage, but in really championing the cause and showing leadership across their sector. So we started off as a project of Citizens UK, which is a community organising group with a specific approach to developing grassroots leaders trained to engage the widest range of stakeholders possible, and to really focus on building power together for change. And the movement began at a meeting in East London when citizens brought together representatives from a number of grassroots organisations, including community institutions like schools and faith groups, universities, and the same issue kept coming up again and again of low pay. At the time, the minimum wage was something like £3.70, which I believe is around $5 US. And some people were working up to 3 minimum wage jobs, and they were still struggling to make ends meet. So they organised, they marched, and they succeeded in calling for staff in East London hospitals initially to be paid a living wage, but gradually that element of community organising became better coordinated, they grew in number, and the movement went national in 2011, which was when we got our first national living wage rate, and that was launched and the foundation itself was established. We recently did some research around what the key elements are for building a national living wage movement, and we landed on 3. One is the importance of community power, 2 is political power, and 3 is corporate power. And the combination of all 3 of those has been absolutely essential for us. It was actually KPMG who emphasised to us the importance of that last element of corporate power, and they showed true leadership in first of all, accepting that first meeting with campaigners about adopting the living wage, but they also really got behind the initiative, and they dedicated CSR staff time and expertise to ensure that the foundation itself would be a successful operation from a business perspective. They opened up their contacts to us, they provided opportunities for the team to deliver proposals to senior stakeholders across the private sector. They invested a lot of time in helping us identify and evidence the tangible business benefits, which I will go to in more detail soon, but it's really just to highlight how we should never underestimate the power of being able to bring just 1 or 2 senior people within an organisation on board. And in fact, it was someone from Aviva, one of our other employer champions, who recently said that the best way to accelerate a company's journey to becoming a real living wage employer is to have at least 1 champion who has the strength of character to stand up to the skeptics. So I think that's important to bear in mind as we move along. If we could go to the next slide, there are essentially 3 elements that make up the core of our work: accreditation, intelligence, and influence. Accreditation is probably the most visible aspect of what we do, which is publicly recognising employers that are paying a real living wage by awarding them the employer seal, that within the conditions of our licence agreement they're free to use in all of their internal and external communications. And essentially it's the mark of a responsible employer who commits to A, paying all directly employed staff the living wage immediately. The living wage also applies to people who deliver services on the premises, so catering, cleaning, security. So they also have to have a plan in place to roll out the living wage across all third-party contracts as they come up for renewal, and that usually happens over 2 to 3 years. Tied to that, we also run a recognised service provider scheme for those organisations that provide those services on site, and I'll go into that a bit later. But essentially it's a long-term commitment to the rates, which are revised in line with the cost of living each year in the UK. Intelligence is a second strand, and that revolves around providing advice and support on how employers can go about implementing the living wage, from co-development of a plan for uplifting contracted staff, or setting up internal working groups that might be responsible for delivery of the general project, or maybe advising the different departments that are either impacted by the decision to pay a living wage, or they play a key role in implementation. And in terms of influence, we engage in a range of public spaces to educate and raise awareness of this issue, and our main event of the year is Living Wage Week in November, which other movements around the world are now starting to adopt to kind of make this an international moment. And it's also when the foundation recognises and celebrates the leadership shown by living wage employers in a wide range of ways beyond uplifting their own staff. So if we could move to the next slide, we've now grown our network to include almost 8,000 accredited living wage employers across the UK, and that includes around 43 of the FTSE 100, as well as a huge number of small and medium-sized enterprises. We obviously still have a long way to go in the UK, but while these figures might be a bit of a drop in the ocean, we can say with confidence that living wage employers make up over 5% of the workforce. So 1 in 20 people here work for an accredited organisation. And so far, in the 10 years since we've been established, over 270,000 low-paid workers have been given pay rises amounting to over 1.4 billion. So we know that change takes time, but we also know that it can really happen when everyone gets together to make the change. If we move to the next slide, this is just a very small selection of employers that are in our network. And in fact, these companies are actually our principal partners, who have over the years provided financial support for the foundation and the campaign and various other specific projects. And they also contribute to the governance of the organisation through our advisory council, which I'll touch on later too. Before we go on to the next slide, I mean, besides the financial impact that has been made for workers themselves, we wanted to understand how employers experience those impacts and what benefits they've seen across the business. So in 2017, we partnered up with the Cardiff Business School to carry out a survey of our entire network. And if we move on now, you can see the results of that survey, and you can see that the vast majority of them saw some kind of benefit to paying a living wage, up to 93% of them. And they also commonly saw improvements relating to reputation, motivation and retention rates. Having that point of difference that sets them apart from their competitors is really important to them, and improved relationships between managers and staff. So that really kind of making sure that we were tracking the kind of experience of employers who have been through it and who have been through that kind of initial scary phase of not really knowing whether their own business is maybe financially resilient enough to make that progress. It's been really important for us to have these figures. We're almost actually finished the same process of surveying our network this year to see how those benefits have evolved over time. And they're literally coming in now, so I'll be excited to share those with you over the next few weeks, hopefully. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'll kind of delve a little bit into some of the individual experiences. I've spoken about KPMG already. They are obviously a leader of professional services, including audit and tax and advisory services. They're part of KPMG's global network of professional firms providing these services, and they employ over 155,000 individuals in 155 countries, and around 11,500 partners and staff are based in the UK. And you can see here the kind of stark drop in turnover that they experienced within the first year of implementation among their cleaning staff, changes to business practice, improved efficiency, staff retention and employee motivation and flexibility. The training and development aspect of it was a bit of a surprise one for us, but it makes sense when you look at the change in turnover. And that initial increased cost of wages, they did over time see how that was offset by reductions in recruitment costs and increased skills and productivity of staff. So moving on to the next slide, Tube Lines is a company that oversees the cleaning of quite a big part of our London Underground network. And they also kind of saw how they were able to attract a much higher caliber of staff with many more applications from people who wanted to work for them. So they definitely were able to get those from much further away from where they were located as well. So that was important to them. If we move on to the next slide, Penrose Care is a much smaller organisation. And it was interesting for us the drivers and motivating factors for them to come onto a living wage. So for them, really reducing the disruption that's associated with constant advertising and recruitment and onboarding and induction of new staff was really important to them. The reduced level of absenteeism and sick days was really important, and also just knowing that from a reputational perspective, knowing that loved ones were being looked after by people who were being paid a living wage was really important for their customers as well. So all compelling factors for Penrose Care. And not to forget the workers themselves. If we move on to the next slide, we know that being paid a living wage has an enormous impact in their lives. And we're not just talking about the obvious ability to be able to afford the absolute basic needs of everyday life. It goes far beyond that. In fact, the European Association of Work and Organisational Psychology carried out a study that found that living wages raise perceptions of organisational justice that lead to the start of a positive spiral for employees. So when the workplace becomes a supportive and respectful place to be, there's a rise in morale. People are able to work smarter because they're less depleted through stress about how they're going to survive and support their families, or through having to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. So that's from the kind of worker perspective. And if we kind of go on to the next slide, I can't emphasize enough the importance of collaboration with every type of kind of stakeholder that needs to be around the table when you're thinking about implementation of a living wage. And it's something that we hadn't really acknowledged in the UK until we started our global work, the strength of our governance. So you can see the Living Wage Foundation is at the heart of that. Citizens UK remains our parent organisation. And the calculation itself is overseen by the Commission, and they update the figures each year. They provide robust independent direction on those rates and the calculation of those rates each year. They'll make decisions on how to incorporate policy changes, and they'll add new sources of data into the calculation, and they also keep that under review to ensure that the living wage remains fully representative of life in the UK today. So then there's the Advisory Council, so they advise on the overall strategy and direction of the foundation, our principal partners, and all of this has allowed us to really diversify into other areas. So we can start looking at living hours, for example, which I'll touch on later, living wage funders, so encouraging any kind of funder to incorporate the language of living wage into their grant applications, living wage places, where that community-based factor comes in really strongly again, recognised service providers I'll come on to in a minute, as well as global, and we've just started and set up our living wage pension steering group. So these are all aspects of decent work that we know are important and are related and have to be part of the conversation as well. So if we could move on to the next slide, our recognised service provider scheme, essentially it's for those providers of service staff that provide services on site for employers. It's obviously a challenge to bring all of those contracted staff onto a living wage immediately, so we ask for them to provide both a living wage bid and a quote, and a market rate quote to all customers and clients, and that means that there's a greater chance over time that an incremental increase in the number of contracts that are living wage rate will eventually bring them onto a full living wage employer status. And this is kind of proven quite an interesting and rich area for exploration in terms of looking at supply chains more generally. How can we start to look at that to think about goods as well as services perhaps? So it's something that we're looking at. And if we move on to the next slide, we very recently carried out our first living hours accreditation. Now, in many parts of the world, it will be about kind of reducing the number of hours in order to avoid kind of exploitation of workers. In the UK, we're looking for to avoid precarious employment and provide decent notice of shifts, have a guaranteed number of hours so that workers have some semblance of stability with the work that they're doing. So we've just kind of refined that process and given our first accreditation for that. Global, so we've been looking at this since around 2015. If we move on to the next slide, we've really had two kind of drivers for our global project, and it's been interesting for us to observe over the last year an increase in civil society movements around the world reaching out to us as they start to focus specifically on living wage alongside the range of issues that's usually their main focus, but which we know are exacerbated by in-work poverty, whether that's access to nutrition, violence against women and girls, education, etc. And I think that really does reflect increasing understanding that payment of a living wage is critical to addressing so many other issues. And at a global level, it's also essential to achievement of at least 8 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So these organisations are now looking to collaborate in a much more meaningful way with the private sector than many of them have ever done before, in the same way that citizens began to do 20 years ago in the UK. If we could move on to the next slide, we've seen over the last year just how fragile and complex global supply chains are. And so for companies to reduce risk at the furthest reaches of the supply chain, they're really going to need to understand at quite a deep level what it takes to implement living wages in their own operations so that they can fully exercise the influence they hold across the rest of their supply chain by championing the issue, exchanging learning with suppliers who might already be undertaking their own journey towards implementation. So it's really just to emphasize that employers are taking on a much bigger role in many ways beyond paying the living wage to their own staff. So we set up our global affiliate network in the countries listed in that slide, and that's really kind of solely been in response to demand for that kind of understanding of what happened in the UK to get that national consensus around the rate. So we want to be a bit more strategic about our outreach and country engagement in future, but it's really interesting to see the range of different contexts and the differing conversations that organisations in these countries are having, and the methods that they're employing to kind of advance that movement. And I would say that in terms of a fully affiliated accreditation scheme like ourselves, we're really pleased that a national body in the US is going to be launching in November this year called Living Wage for Us. And so that will be fully launched and announced, I think, closer to November, maybe October as well. So lots of exciting stuff happening there. I think that's everything from me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. This is all really enlightening. We don't have any questions in our box yet. Anyone who's listening right now, if you have any questions surrounding the presentation or for Shaheen, feel free to just pop them in the questions box. And Leon or Jimson, do you have any questions or thoughts?
I have a question. Shaheen, you talked about a UK national living wage. How does one account for, at least here, quite varied costs of living in some urban versus non-urban settings? Like if I think of Zoe being in New York versus Durham versus when I lived in the Appalachian Mountains, they're very, very different costs of living. And I'm curious how your program or the UK deals with that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in one sense it's probably quite clearly a lot easier for us because we are a tiny island, and the cost of living, although it does vary, we've got 2 rates, one for the higher cost of living in London and one for the rest of the UK. And the methodology that we use is really based, it's called a minimum income standard. And it's really based on an approach which focuses on continually engaging with the public about what they think constitutes a living wage in terms of what should be in the basket of goods. And that is represented according to family types as they appear in the general population, so a weighted reflection of population as well. And that's done every single year. There are lots of different approaches to defining what the methodology should be, and in fact, this is something that we're looking to really align ourselves on as a global movement. That's the other strand of my work at global level, is a lot of the kind of living income and living wage conversation has kind of been focused on supply chains, and mainly focused actually on perhaps lower and middle income countries. And so now we're looking at how do we adjust some of those methodologies. The gold standard is the anchor methodology, ANKR, that's the gold standard, and we're looking at, well, what differences are there that need to be made applicable to local context. So in the US effort, for example, I know they kind of did the anchor study, but they had to also look at childcare costs and healthcare costs, because obviously that's a whole other challenge that we in the UK did not have to think about. We're very lucky to have our National Health Service, and so there are many different kind of things that you need to think about. So yeah, lots of approaches, and we're now working to bring together a whole range of different experts in global bodies to show that we can align ourselves on this, and really offer maybe particularly to some of the bigger multinational companies, some sort of consensus in an approach. And we're slowly starting to see the light in terms of possibly getting there.
I'm curious, sorry, I'm not familiar with the method that you had mentioned for the gold standard. Is that including, do you take into consideration like the benefits of jobs? I know you'd mentioned like ensuring that employers were giving the correct amount of hours, or like an appropriate amount if the employee wants, but does it take into consideration if an employer provides food, or is that all in the metric?
So this is definitely straying into territory that I'm not an expert in, but I do know that, for example, in the US effort, where benefits are really important to think about how they contribute to a living wage, they have developed a tool to understand how to calculate the difference between cash wages and how benefits contribute to that. So definitely looking at health insurance, childcare vouchers, all those different types of things, travel to work, maybe all of those can be factored in. So definitely know that's really important. But I'm not going to say any more in case I say the wrong thing.
You mentioned the question of looking at this globally and in countries that have different kind of economic levels. We have quite a bit of family in Mexico through my wife, and when we were there, particularly in 2015, visiting family in Mexico City, Guadalajara, and then very, very rural, the cost of living, so this kind of relates into what we would think about in terms of coffee farmers, like how much does the money that we're paying mean specifically on a community level? You know, our cousins in a very small town lived middle class off of the US equivalent of $330 a month, whereas in Mexico City, one meal at a nice restaurant was like $200. Mm-hmm. And that's something when we try to look at our system, like what is our impact on the farm level, having a sense of what money means in a specific place can be so varied. And it would be really sweet to have something where we would be able to have real data on that.
Yeah, and I would maybe suggest looking at the work of IDH. They are the Dutch Sustainable Trading Initiative, and they've really been looking at development of a tool. They call it the salary matrix tool, and they look at primarily agricultural at the moment. They're also starting to look into manufacturing supply chains as well, but it really helps to understand and assess the living wage gaps throughout supply chains. So that could be a real help to you there.
Thank you.
I also had another question. So you talked a little bit about how, it was hard for businesses at first, or it maybe seemed nerve-wracking, but they saw a lot of rewards in the end for adjusting their standards and improving upon them. I was wondering if you saw any sort of like creative ways or steps that some of these companies took to sort of get where they were going, because I think it's a challenge. Like I've run a bunch of businesses, and in New York, for instance, we had about a 30% minimum wage hike over 3 years a few years back, and it was really scary. We're a small business, and we're like, and so we had to come up with some sort of like creative ways or sort of step-by-step plans to get there. So I was curious if you sort of witnessed some of those, or if you have any sort of suggestions for people to sort of ease their minds or give them thoughts about how to
Yeah,
make
so
progress.
I hope, yeah, and I imagine that you're kind of focusing on the immediate short term, because I think perhaps I've demonstrated over time the reduction in recruitment costs, and some of the other benefits might offset those initial kind of costs in terms of implementation. And I'd say that definitely ensuring that you're connecting with other businesses, that you're connecting with local community to understand how best to kind of set up the right working group for implementation. I have to be honest and say it's not going to be possible for every single business to come onto a living wage already. That's why we're here, right? That's why we're really starting to look at this. But it's about wage growth, where we don't have an immediate rate, where it's not immediately possible to uplift immediately. It's about getting the structures in place to make it happen incrementally as and when it's possible. And that should be sooner rather than later.
That's really helpful. Thank you. We also have a bunch of questions now that have showed up in the chat box. So from Kate, they say they're participating in the inaugural first 100 businesses in the US and working on a spreadsheet audit. That it's complicated and formatted, and calculation formulas don't always match up with the form. And then I guess this is somewhat specific.
I'm familiar with
how to calculate things like bonuses differs from what reporting allows for on the form.
Mm-hmm. So I'm familiar with that effort and that tool that you might be using if you're one of the first 100 in the US. And what I understand is that you have available to you a huge amount of advice and guidance to support around how those tools are used. Because again, the complexity of the US landscape and having to think about not just state by state but county by county calculations is going to be tricky. It's going to be a challenge, and that's why in the US there is. In the UK, we do not offer nearly as much consultation time in terms of implementation. We've got two conditions: you uplift your staff, directly employed staff immediately, and third party, like we know what the rates are. There's no issue there. But that extra consultation is available to employers in the US, and I would say make the most of that you possibly can. Because that's what's going to help you cut through the complexity of the tools and the challenge that you've got, and also bringing in colleagues from different departments who can help provide the data that's needed. And I think that's kind of a different point to the complexity of the tool. It's about getting buy-in from colleagues. What I would also kind of point to is guidance that was published recently from the UN Global Compact. It's implementation guidance on living wage. They've got a really great practical 10 steps to how a company should look at this, from how to get senior buy-in to how to set up an internal working group cross-departmentally, how to identify an external partner to help with these bits and pieces. So definitely recommend looking at that.
It's super helpful. Yeah, there's also some nice comments here. Kendall's opening a shop in Guadalajara. Okay, for someone who is looking to start their own coffee shop in the future but doesn't have much financial capital just yet at this moment, would you suggest to save up and hold off on opening the coffee shop until one can afford to pay a team a living wage? Or do you suggest to open and then try to become financially successful to the point where one day they can afford to pay their team a living wage?
I'm going to share.
This is a tough one.
Well, I'm going to share a quote from someone in our network that's kind of stuck with me when actually it's from New Zealand, and they were talking about the impact that COVID has had on their business, and there was some quite tough questions about the accreditation that they had there, and they kind of said, look, if we are not paying a living wage on the other side of this thing, then we don't want to exist as a business, because for us. It's really important for us that it's the foundation of what we do. So my suggestion is always going to be kind of hold off and make that an integral part of the business model, because it's not just about, you know, it being the right thing to do. And as you say, we're all kind of agreed on it's wonderful for everyone to be able to access those benefits as workers. But in terms of creating a strong, resilient, shockproof workforce that can manage the turbulence, especially of those early years, is going to be really important.
Yeah, I'd agree with that one. Then that without being able to have a decent workforce at the beginning, then how are you going to be able to be successful in any case?
Yeah, the question correlates into something that's through time. So I don't think you can really save up for it. You have to be able to maintain it. I know for us, part of our whole startup and narrative was communicating with our public about our values. And because of that, and including last year, you know, part of why I think we are here is because our public is part of our effort, you know, including our wages. Like we actually, and I think like a lot of coffee companies put up the ability for the public to actually contribute extra money to help with wages. For instance, we had 3 cases last year of COVID and ended up quarantining about 10 people around them. And the public contributed $12,000 to help us pay for that. And so I think that narrative of, you know, I think living wage becomes, and all the value system behind a business becomes possible by a relationship between the business, its mission and values, the public, and the public being also sharing the values, but being educated as well in terms of like, why does this matter? And then how well can we collaborate with our teams in such a way that act on the business standpoint and the public standpoint is as meaningful to the team as possible. The truth is, when we hit living wages, it's only a small part of what we hope to do. And it's an ongoing process where you work to get better and better and better. And so I think those 3 parts are part of the equation that you embed to be doing that work.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And that it needs to be a sort of a core philosophy, and it's not just about the money. It's about supporting your workers and your team members, and they'll actually support you as well when it comes times of trouble. It's not just a one-way street. When in Canada, in Toronto, when the sort of pandemic thing got nasty, there were only going to be initially just a couple of months of wage support for the people that we had to lay off. And when it came time to do that, I was going to lose, you know, half of my trained staff as they left. And I don't know what the numbers are in your countries, but in ours, about 60% of hospitality workers have not come back to the business. So what I did as really not a way to make money is I opened a pop-up coffee shop on the other side of town, which allowed me to hire the staff in the second location that I was having to lay off in the first location. And that really wasn't about money. It was really selfishly as a business owner, not wanting to lose the knowledge base that I've got. And that allowed, well, the pop-up's still going actually a year later. And then we hired more people as things started to come back on the other side. So it's more than just the money, you know. It's a philosophy, and if you care, not just the money side of it, like you were saying, Leon, the wages is part of it, but it's not all of it. You know, how much time do we spend juggling people's needs for different hours, different availability? We have a core of full-time with a whole series of part-time people that can fill in, flexibility when people have to go to I don't know, daycare or have some time off or whatever. It's all part of supporting the worker, and not just at a financial sense, and really developing a team. And if your business is absolutely model is based on, you know, a couple of dollars an hour difference at the bottom line at the beginning, you're in a risky situation. I think it needs to be, you need to think of that as part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Most definitely. It's not an easy answer, and it's those are both such a great comments on it. With both Leon and Jimson talking about COVID, I'm curious about, with the last year, Shaheen, how that's sort of, what that's changed really in the overall way these businesses you've worked with are, you know, adjusting in terms of living wage.
Well, I can say that, like everyone else, initially we were really worried, really concerned, really hearing a lot of concern from businesses as well, as to how, you know, they were going to be able to remain accredited, or whether they were able to uplift onto the new rates that were going to be announced in November. All these kind of immediate cash flow problems were obviously a really, really urgent priority. And so there was a part of us that did have to accept that not everybody would be able to continue. We did have to close off some accreditations. That was just part of it. Another cohort kind of said, look, we can't uplift now, but we can remain. We'll hold on by the skin of our teeth, sort of thing, and we'll make sure we uplift as soon by a deadline that was set. And while there was that widespread fear and concern initially, that changed pretty quickly within a matter of months, because I've definitely noticed, especially at a global level, the amount of attention and momentum that is now gathering around this issue is kind of unreal. So many people were not even thinking about this before, but there's just a bigger understanding of how important this is for businesses to keep their staff safe and healthy, to keep it going. And so, yeah, short answer is, while it was initially a real concern, we've had more interest and uplift than before even.
Presumably that's also tied in with quality of life, quality of work, starting to work remotely from home, and make people think about that there is more to being happy than just working not remotely. It's more of a quality of life thing.
Yeah. And I'd say that's testament, again, I mentioned the improved relationship between kind of managers and staff, and that kind of organizational justice aspect of it. I've seen, what's been really interesting in all of this is to see how really kind of hardened businessmen of multinational corporations have really kind of become gung-ho in how they've championed the issue, really engaging with civil society, because what they've done is they've broke down that barrier. Because you've got so many different types of stakeholders that need to be around the table, but they're all kind of speaking their own languages, right? They're all kind of speaking, this is the corporate speak, this is the civil society terminology, this is the kind of academic way that we speak about. So there's a bit of kind of fear and hesitation initially, but once you break down those barriers with the convenings, with the kind of joint actions and collaboration, once you get that confidence, it's really wonderful to see.
I have a question for you, Shaheen, about so it's quite easy to get statistics from, you know, the big corporations, because they have the opportunity to be able to do big statistics, and presumably some of the medium-sized places as well. And I guess the difficulty is it's more anecdotal when it comes to the smaller businesses. Or are you able to kind of glean out some data at the smaller end?
Yeah, I mean, the example from Penrose Care was from a much smaller organization. I don't have the exact figures, but what I can do is I'll share, I can't remember when we did this study, but we did look specifically at SMEs and gather quite a bit of data from that. So let me put in the chat now a bit of that. I don't recall it right away off the top of my head, but I'll share it with you now.
And someone had asked before about specific links, but Shaheen was kind enough to offer to share your email if there is any follow-up questions as well. So we'll put that in the chat for everyone.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
You mentioned in New York City the kind of ramp up of wages, and that happening slightly dramatically in a short period of time.
Mhm.
I think I'm curious in terms of how y'all handled that, and how much that affected pricing, and yeah, how it worked. Because I think Durham has gone from, at least by MIT's standard, something like in 2013 $9 all the way through to 15 last year, and you're like, all right, you want to say, all right, we want to commit to something, but we want to make sure we can keep up. And there, with such dramatic cost differences, how you do that. And it's coming into today's session, I was like, all right, do we actually have a calculator? As we need to be able to pay this much, we ultimately need to be able to charge this much. And the public has done well going along with that. But I'm kind of curious, having gone through kind of a quick, short ramp up, how that worked.
Yeah, well, I can't speak for everyone. I saw different companies handling it differently. In some more dramatic cases, there was a lot of high-level, high-salary staff being cut from some companies. On the other hand, I saw not as much. I don't know how I feel about this. I didn't see a very large like core coffee price increase at the time, just like a little bit. But I think I saw a lot more creative menus in cafes. So like you start seeing a lot more alcohol, a lot more food, a lot more other items being sold. So I think businesses generally were getting more creative with how they were going to increase their revenue stream.
Yeah.
To adjust. And then what was cool, me at the time, I was the director of retail for a company. I was meeting with, I guess it was like 4 or 5 other people in charge of retail shops for other like somewhat well-known specialty coffee shops. And we were sort of collectively trying to troubleshoot and adjust and figure out like how to do this together as a community. And I found that extremely helpful. And at the time, the people I was meeting with all sort of like, I feel like their businesses did all right. Like we all were seeing positives in all of it, as opposed to like, a big scary negative number and wondering how we're going to, cover payroll.
Right.
I don't know if that answered your question. It was sort of like a broad and loose.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the whole question kind of pairing together what you just said and what Jimson said, the whole kind of innovation of like, all right, Jimson opened up a second pop-up that then was like a pivot and a move to be able to survive something very challenging, or like doing certain things within your menu. Because it's interesting, like with alcohol, somebody could charge $14 for a drink in Durham, nobody bats an eyelash at it. But as coffee starts rising, it's like there's something about coffee that we have to overcome, the fact that a good portion of the population considers it a daily thing, and we've had to assert more value to what we sell, I think, in the industry.
Oh, that is the ongoing challenge, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, completely. We have to start considering putting prices up again. We're about to get we're being hit with increased costs now, and not just the wages, but it's primarily the non-wage component, which is starting to get tricky. Packaging and our supply costs, and yeah, we have people that show up, with the exact change every day, and they know what it's going to be, and even if it's only 5 points or whatever, it does change routine, and it does change perception. I think we're about to go into quite a serious round of inflation at the price level the next couple of months here in Canada. I'm assuming it's the same in the States. I see the CPI going up, and presumably the same in the UK, right?
See. Okay,
as inflation goes up, how do you think that that's going to affect the living wage calculations, Shaheen?
I think because we have been around for quite a long time, there have been various crises that have kind of weathered the storm, I guess. And now, it's the same principles that are going to guide people through it that we need now, in terms of kind of more and different types of stakeholders needing to be brought in to address those specific challenges, engaging more with policymakers as well to help reduce the cost of living where possible. Yeah, but it's something that we're definitely going to have to keep an eye on. But again, as long as we have that structure, that governance I mentioned, kind of underpinning the calculation with that independent commission, the Living Wage Commission, you know, we have such a wide range of academics, unions, economic experts, employers, all involved in that, all having this conversation, that are way smarter than me, to be able to kind of think about how that calculation should be kind of how we respond to those challenges on an ongoing basis.
Okay, well, we have about 9 more minutes. So if anyone has any final questions, throw them in the box there. And then I thought, if anyone has any like final thoughts they would like to share, Shaheen, Jimson, Leon, we could go over that. And then I'll introduce what we're gonna have next week. Oh, I got one question from, oh, sorry. I got one question from the crowd, and then you, Leon. When corporates reduce their headcount due to COVID pandemic, did that somehow look at by this movement or any other movement? I guess, yeah, when corporations sort of reduce their overall employee, how did this sort of affect all of this, I guess, is the question. Does that make sense?
Are you going to come in there, Jimson?
Well, if we reduce the headcount, then I did my best to not reduce the headcount, because I see it more as a global thing of trying to support my staff through it. So we didn't cut wages, and I did what I could to be able to maintain the workforce by expanding activity, albeit one that didn't make any money. It wasn't the goal was not to make money in the pop-up. The goal was for me to not lose my skilled, trained, and lovely staff, and not just at a sort of at a personal moral level, but the other level. But I don't know if you're cutting the number of your headcount, which is understandable with the activity, that shouldn't change what the wages are for the other people, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, the underpinning principle under this is do no harm, right? And I think everyone needs to kind of keep that in mind. That's why we kind of started diversifying and looking at hours and other decent work conditions that are really important to all of this.
Because having a living wage should not be by sacrificing headcount. That's not the point. The point is that the people who are there are being looked after properly in a better way. And by having, if you've got too many staff, you've got too many staff. That's nothing to do with the wages, as far as I'm concerned. And the headcount is more related to activity and organizational health than anything else.
One thing I didn't manage to touch on, and I might do so very briefly here, is at global level, yes, it's a totally different journey for smaller businesses as opposed to the multinationals. But because of the activity that's ramping up at global level, it's kind of something that a conversation that you're not going to be able to avoid for a huge amount of time, just because organizations like the World Benchmarking Alliance They launched their SDG 2000 last year, so it's a list of the top 2,000 companies in the world that have greatest influence over achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And they are going to be kind of publicly ranked according to performance in a range of social areas, everything, and living wage is a component of that. So that scrutiny combined with kind of increasing calls for regulation and policy. I know that across Europe, an organisation has proposed legislation on living wage specifically for the garment and textile industry, including recommendations like imposing tariffs on what they deem to be kind of high-risk countries for those low wage issues. So all of these are things that we're not really going to be able to avoid for a whole lot longer.
I think one of the, I tend to think a lot about very, very small business owners. And I know a lot of people either won't ask or can be very shy about talking about this because you're scared. I think particularly in coffee, most people, especially in smaller coffee, really do care about impact. And so it's to say, well, if these are part of my value system, how do we do it? And so for us, I think you start with the value system, you embed that. I have a phrase that I like to use, which is enough is plenty. If Aurelian and I were only about getting rich, we would do something different probably. I think, for us, it's a decades-long project whereby we hope all the sacrifice and debt and so forth that we've taken on will, in the long run, pay off, not in a kind of normal American, or not normal, but American 300 to 1, CEO to average worker pay thing, but how do you correlate risk to reward, expertise to reward, time and commitment to reward? How do you do that in a way that all boats rise together? How can we better connect to our team so that, that they can do well as part of the company and we can do well as people who've, sacrificed quite a bit. So I think just starting with that framework and embedding that, I do want to say it's easy to talk about. It takes a lot of work. We are not, I think in our company, we're like 65% of where we want to go. We have so much more that we want to do. And I think we're about 10 years in. For us to do well, we have to keep on connecting with our team, become better teams of collaborators. We've worked really hard at becoming more open book because I think people understanding how money works and where money works within the company allows us to together have less waste. Like if we have X less waste, can we add a family leave program? Doing some of that together is part of how you get there. It's very imperfect. In today's kind of social world, it can be very tricky where sometimes good deeds can go punished, but you stick to like what matters to us. How do we allow this project to best benefit everybody involved, including the team, including ourselves, including the third-party vendors, including coffee farmers and so forth, of which this is one very important part.
I love all of that, Leon. Thank you so much. And I think it's the core here. It's just, we all have to be, that's why we're doing this, the Barista Guild. It's a conversation. It's that, everybody's a work in progress. Nowhere in the world has figured out the living wage equation perfectly. And so that's why we're doing this, is sort of keep communication open, share our sort of stories and what's been working and not working in different places, and trying to provide more resources and food for thought for everyone, from the hourly worker to the people that own businesses and want to know how they can better support the hourly workers that work for them. So thank you. So next week, we're going to have a roundtable discussion. I'll be here again with my peer Paco on different approaches to living income in coffee. So we talked a little bit about that in this one too, just like different ways to sort of meet that demand, those changes or the need to pay people more, as opposed to just, you know, well, I guess there is no perfect classic way, but and also this episode, as well as the last two, are on the YouTube channel. You can just search Barista Guild on YouTube and find them there. Each one is unique. You don't have to watch all three. You can watch piecemeal it. And so that's that. And I think that's, do we have another slide? I don't, yes. You can also check out our social media for more information. This is an ongoing conversation, an important topic for the Barista Guild Leadership Council. So it's not going to just end with this webinar series. So sort of stay tuned for more information to come and more conversations. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for listening in and attending, and thank all of you for presenting and sharing the work that you do and your thoughts, Leon and Jimson and Shaheen. And yeah, I think that's pretty much a wrap for us, unless anyone has any last additions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to talk with you all.
Thanks so much. Happy people makes for happy life and good business.
Exactly. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thanks.
Good. Bye.
Take care.